Hello, and welcome to This Week in Sociological Perspective. I'm your host, Samuel Roundfield Lucas. This week, we discuss a spate of articles about COVID. But first, I recently spoke with Professor Justine Tinkler of the University of Georgia about a recent paper titled Sexual Harassment Training and Men's Motivation to Work with Women. The paper is to be published in Social Science Research and is co-authored by Jody Clay Warner and Malissa Alinor. Professor Tinkler, thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you.
So your paper focuses on potential effects of sexual harassment training. Is sexual harassment training common?
Yes, sexual harassment training became sort of a popular way for most organizations to respond to basically the threat of lawsuit in the 1990s. And so very large organizations tend to have sexual harassment training. And it's sort of a common way to make sure that all employees learn about what is appropriate and what's inappropriate in the workplace. That said, there are a lot of organizations that don't have sexual harassment training. Smaller organizations don't. And then there are also different states with different laws. Like in California, for example, it's basically required that supervisors get trained in sexual harassment. Whereas where I am in Georgia, I've never had, workplace sexual harassment training here. So there's variation, but it's very common. It's a common preventative tool that organizations use to attempt to prevent sexual harassment, but also to be able to show evidence if they ever get sued that they, have in fact been attempting to prevent this from happening in their workplace.
So how is sexual harassment training conducted? I mean, what are some of the activities that go into those kinds of training efforts?
So there's variation, but I would say that the vast majority of people in this day and age get trained online. So it's fairly common for organizations. Basically, sexual harassment training is sort of proprietary. There's companies that create these trainings, and then organizations pay the company to provide these trainings to their employees. And so nowadays, it's most common that these trainings are online, and they'll be scenario based where they'll basically go through what the organization's rules are about sexual harassment and then provide some possible scenarios one might face to try and sort of give some advice about how you should respond if you end up witnessing sexual harassment or end up being a victim of it. And so that's sort of the most common. There are other formats. Some organizations, there's some companies that do like sort of theater troupe trainings where they actually hire actors to come in and play out sexual harassment scenarios. I've seen mock sort of courtroom sexual harassment trainings. So those are the sort of primary formats, but the most common one is an online training that people largely see as a bureaucratic necessity, and it sort of is not, necessarily particularly engaging. Sometimes there's a quiz at the end so that, the company is sort of making sure people are paying attention.
So the title of your paper implies that there might be a relationship between sexual harassment training and men's motivation to work with women. Why might there be a relationship, and what kind of relationship might it be?
Sure.
So theoretically, what are the possibilities before you started your study?
So I think I'll go back and I'll tell you how we got to this study, and then maybe that'll help sort of lay it out. For my dissertation many years ago, I was interested in understanding the effect of sexual harassment policy training on people's beliefs about men and women. And so basically, I conducted a number of studies using various methods to sort of try and understand how sexual harassment policy training affected people's gender beliefs. And in general, what I found in all of these studies was this unfortunate unintended consequence, which is that oftentimes sexual harassment policy training actually tends to reinforce traditional gender stereotypes and incite sort of like a backlash reaction, negative attitudes about women. And so that research, I've done it in a lot of different ways, and I sort of just kept finding that effect, which is unfortunate. So, I've continued to do work trying to understand sort of the mechanisms at play here, like why is it that that happens, and so on. So fast forward some years after this research was conducted and the Me Too movement happened. And this was in 2017, when, a lot of people were talking about sexual harassment, and a lot of people were talking, sort of naming and sort of socially stigmatizing, those who perpetrated sexual harassment online. So at this time, the media was interested suddenly in my research. And so I got a lot of media, calling me and wanting to find out more. And in particular, people, what people wanted to know, that the media wanted to know, was, why do we have this problem? Like we've been training people on sexual harassment for a long time, but it seems like there's still a lot of sexual harassment. And so anyways, one of the questions that I kept getting asked by journalists was, you seem like you're interested in these unintended consequences of training. Do you think it's possible that all this attention to the issue of sexual harassment is actually making men wary of working with women? So maybe men are hearing this and hearing about all of these people, getting shamed online and are scared that maybe they'll accidentally be accused of sexual harassment, or perhaps in some sort of act of vengeance on the part of a woman. And this would just lead to sort of a wide scale fear among men that they might not want to work with women as much to avoid being accused of sexual harassment. So I thought that was an interesting question. I don't know the answer, but I thought, well, we should find out. So I would say, I guess, to come back to answer your question, I think sort of the most obvious reason why people would be wary to be motivated, why men would be wary to work with women, would be that they're afraid that they'll be accused of sexual harassment. So yeah.
But so I see that now that you've said it. I'm wondering though, but when companies introduce sexual harassment sensitivity training, they're not doing it, I presume, to lead men to be wary of working with women. So isn't there a hypothesis on the other side that the training would make men either have no effect on their willingness to work with women or comfort, or maybe even make it more comfortable because they now know what they feel maybe they would be informed. Before they were a little wary, like, oh, what's going to happen because women haven't been in this workplace in these positions before, but now they are, and now this gives me some guidance on how to. I'm just trying to figure out, is it the assumption was simply one way, or was it that it could have gone either way in your
Yeah, I mean, going into the study, again, when the journalists asked me the question, I genuinely didn't know the answer, because I could imagine it going either way. I certainly think there was a sort of cultural discourse rising out of the Me Too movement that was like, we're talking about this too much now. This is going to lead to all these negative things, the backlash against women and so on. So that discourse was the sort of like, men, be afraid, we're coming for you, the witch trial sort of thing. On the other hand, what we also witnessed that I think maybe isn't quite as splashy in terms of, media attention, is a lot more men were, being made aware of the problem of sexual harassment, and, were expressing, at least on surveys, concern, like, oh, we don't really want this problem in our workplace. So our question was really, okay, well, what, given these sort of broad discourses at this current time, in this current cultural moment, what effect is sexual harassment training going to have? And on the one hand, it could amplify these fears that women are out to get men, or it could make men feel better about their workplace and, feel more at ease working with women, because now they sort of learn strategies for how to interact with women better. So yeah, we did genuinely go into this project, thinking that it was possible that the training could decrease, increase, or have no effect on men's motivation to work with women.
So it seems like a challenging area to study because there's all these different types of training going on. And so what did you do to gain insight? What was your study? How did you design your study?
Right. So we basically designed this study relying on the paradigm that I had used in my prior research when I was trying to figure out how sexual harassment training affected people's gender stereotypes. So we used basically experimental methods. So in experimental methods, we basically had people come into a lab, and we basically exposed one group to sexual harassment training, another group did not get this training, and then we measured their men's motivation to work with women. So that was sort of the basic design. And the way that we did this was we basically recruited undergraduates to come into the lab. This was for course credit, and we recruited only men. And when they came into the lab, we told them that they were going to be working on a decision-making task with a partner. And then we basically, they were either randomly assigned to be in what we call the policy intervention condition or the control condition. So in the policy intervention condition, they got this brief sexual harassment training. The training was basically developed from a real training for students it was like a training video for students. And we modified it. And we actually we used the same text as this original training, but we put it into a PowerPoint slides where we had sort of men and women narrators alternate the text because we wanted to be able to control for the gender of the trainer. So the training was short. It was like 4 minutes long, but it covered the sort of basics of what people get in these sorts of trainings. So it, basically defined sexual harassment and gave a few examples of where it most often happens for students or occurs for students, and then provided some information about, where you could go on campus if you needed to report or get support in some way. So half the people in the study watched that training. We lied and told them that it was required because they were going to be working with a partner, and that was required of all, work at the university where you were working with a partner. So, and then in the control condition, we lied again, and we told them that the university now required that all students learn how to set up an ergonomically safe computer workspace because there was sort of a rise in repetitive stress injury. So they watched a short video of the same length about setting up their computer workstation. And then once they watched this video, then that was like when the study supposedly started. So then our next goal was to see how, if there was a difference between those who had the training on sexual harassment and those who did not, and their motivation to work with a woman on this next task that they were supposed to be completing together.
So very elaborate design, but it seems like you thought of a lot of challenges and addressed them. So what did you find? What were the key findings from the analysis?
Okay, so I'll talk about the good news first, and then I'll talk about some of the bad news. So the good news, so one thing, and basically after they did these trainings, we then gave them information about some potential people that they could possibly partner with. And then they read some information about this person or multiple people. And then they evaluated them on a number of different characteristics. And then they actually chose which partner they wanted. So presumably, if sexual harassment trainings were doing really bad things, then we would find that the men would be much more likely to not choose a woman partner, to choose a man partner, and in the policy training condition. And that's not what we found. We found basically no difference. So whether they were exposed to the sexual harassment training or not, people were on average slightly more likely to select a woman than a man as their partner. So that's good news in the sense the training isn't having that negative unintended consequence. We also had them evaluate their potential partner on a variety of different ratings. Basically, one set of questions, were like, how well do you think you're going to work together as a team type questions. And we also found no difference on that variable. So that's the good news. So the less good news is that we also asked them to rate their partner with respect to how similar they felt they were to their partner. And in the sexual harassment training condition, they rated their female partner as more dissimilar to them than in the control condition. So this is actually fairly consistent with all of the prior research of mine that I talked about, which is that the trainings do tend to sort of reify these notions of gender difference so that people see men and women as more fundamentally different after sexual harassment training. And I think that's because sexual harassment is sort of a gendered phenomenon, and it's talked about in a way that, sort of reinforces this notion that men are perpetrators and women are victims of these sorts of things. And so even if the training doesn't say that, it's sort of like the cultural stereotypes that we have about sexual harassment. So we got that effect again, basically, in this study. The other sort of complicated thing we found is that we also randomly assigned the participants to either be working, they were told that they were either going to be working with a partner and they would be either a leader or a subordinate, like a helper with this partner. And so they were either going to be sort of in the powerful position working with this partner or in the less powerful position. And we did find that those who'd been assigned to be leaders were more wary of working with a woman after the training than those who were assigned to be helpers. So when the men knew that they would be working with a woman who, imagining that they might be working with a woman who was going to be leading them, who was going to be more powerful than them, the sexual harassment training actually made them more comfortable and less nervous about working with a woman. Whereas for the leaders, it was the opposite case. It sort of amplified their fears about working with a woman.
So taking the full set of findings, the ones that suggest the policy is not having negative side effects, and those showing some concerning side effects, how do you make sense of these findings? What do the findings say about how men may be responding to sexual harassment sensitivity training?
I guess, I would say that with what we found, we can't say for sure. We don't really know what's happening, but I think we have some ideas about what might be happening. And I think one thing that might be happening is that sexual harassment training, the Me Too movement, all of this talk about these issues invokes a lot of uncertainty, some fear, some stereotypes, and it's sort of like a big swirling cultural discourse with a lot of competing messages. And these competing messages have good and bad effects. And so, doesn't seem, at least with this study, to find strong evidence that the average undergraduate male in a one-time task where, he's never really going to get to know this person very well or need to get to know this person very well, it doesn't really sort of invoke fear of having to work with a female partner. It's a fairly low bar, right? In the sense that the stakes are low. I mean, the likelihood of being in a lab and being accused of sexual harassment are extremely low. And so, in that case, this is good news in the sense that it doesn't seem to invoke that fear. But we do see some evidence of fear, which suggests that, there is some extent to which these trainings and all of the messages that come with them do make people think about gender, make people think about what it means to work with a woman in ways that, even if it doesn't make somebody sort of weary of working with the woman, it might, sort of have more subtle effects on your comfort level, and at least on the extent to which you sort of see somebody as being similar or different than you, which is difficult when you're trying to sort of figure out how to reduce gender inequality in the workplace. If the sort of efforts to do that also reify gender stereotypes and this notion of gender difference, then that, isn't great news, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't have training. It just means that we sort of have to think about how can we counter some of these stereotypes that so readily get triggered when we talk about gender.
So maybe this is the answer to the next question, but just in case it isn't, because you may have more to say, thinking about the results of the experiment, is there anything you would say to human resources officials or other company personnel concerned with assuring equity in the workplace? Other strategies they might consider, or things to worry about or be aware of, on the policy domain?
So I have spent a lot of time thinking about that. There are no easy answers to this problem, but I will say I think there are a couple things that that I can feel confident saying organizations should do. So one thing is, if we know, and I think we do at this point, that these sexual harassment trainings do tend to reify gender stereotypes, I think that, it's worth thinking about how we can create sexual harassment trainings that counter these stereotypes more explicitly. And that, does involve, because organizations tend to sort of hire out trainers, like it kind of involves the people who are in charge of training to rethink how they can make these trainings, a little bit less gender stereotypical. So that's one, I think, relatively easy thing that people can do. The other thing I guess I'll say is that one thing that happens in organizations is that when you have a problem like this, and particularly when it's a problem that if you don't handle it well, you'll get sued, and possibly be accused of discrimination. You definitely want to do, everything you can to make it look like you're trying to create an equitable workplace. And sexual harassment trainings, or trainings in general, are sort of a convenient tool in the toolbox for sort of making it look as if you're doing what you can to comply and is doing what you can to sort of, promote a gender equitable workplace. And so in that regard, like, fine, good, let's keep doing them. But we don't want to check the box on solving this issue with solely training, because training is just sort of one thing that we can do. And it's actually fairly easy for it to become the only thing that organizations do, because it is sort of easy to show. It actually costs a fair amount of money. It has some of that performative value of sort of showing your workers, showing the larger world that you care, and it's not enough. So I would say that organizations need to think about it as one tool in their toolbox rather than, the end of solving sexual harassment. And we know that, right? Because we'd have gotten rid of it by now if training was enough.
Well, Professor Tinkler, I want to thank you for doing this important work to sort of get into the guts of what's happening and how it may be operating, because that's going to deepen our understanding of the way the world works. And I want to express my appreciation for you coming on to share your research with us today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was fun to talk about.
Our final segment concerns a spate of articles on long-term prospects of COVID. In the early days of the COVID pandemic, two terms symbolized public health officials' goals. One was flatten the curve. The other was herd immunity. many public health measures were imposed in an effort to flatten the curve, which basically meant to reduce the incidence of the disease to keep hospitals from becoming overwhelmed. The idea was that if the same number of people got the disease, but they didn't get it all at once, then hospitals wouldn't become overwhelmed. And if hospitals could be kept from becoming overwhelmed, people wouldn't die of heart attacks and strokes and other illnesses and injuries simply because they couldn't get treatment from overwhelmed hospitals. Flattening the curve was a short-term goal. Many scientists, commentators, and the wider public looked forward to a more long-term solution: herd immunity. Herd immunity would be established if so many people in the population became immune to the disease that the disease would die out, or, if not die out, at least become exceedingly rare. One route to herd immunity would be for massively large numbers of people to get the disease. Because mortality rates in the early stages of the pandemic were high, and there were no proven treatments, this approach would have likely led to extremely large numbers of deaths. A second route to herd immunity was for a vaccine to be developed and for almost all those able to take the vaccine to take it. Under President Trump's Warp Speed initiative, a vaccine was produced in record time. But vaccine uptake has lagged, such that the United States will not reach the levels of vaccination needed to generate herd immunity. Moreover, the delay has given the pathogen time and millions more opportunities to mutate, which has led to multiple waves of new variants. In that context, 3 news articles are noteworthy. One, a May 6th U.S. News & World Report article titled "Severe COVID May Age Survivors' Brains 20 Years" reports on a disturbing new academic paper. The study tracked survivors who had severe enough illnesses to be hospitalized. The authors found that these patients experienced, quote, a significant drop in memory and concentration skills, alongside a notable slowdown in the ability to problem solve accurately and quickly. The study found that the loss translated, quote, into a 10-point drop in IQ. One study author, Adam Hampshire, noted that the level of underperformance is similar to that seen when aging from 50 to 70. A second article, published in National Geographic about 3 weeks earlier, was titled, "Even Mild COVID-19 Can Cause Your Brain to Shrink." The big takeaway from this study is that about 1 of every 4 COVID survivors is suffering from impaired cognition. The National Geographic article stated, quote, patients hospitalized with COVID-19 are almost 3 times more likely than those not hospitalized to have impaired cognition. But brain scans now show that even a mild case of COVID-19 can shrink part of the brain, causing physical changes equivalent to a decade of aging. A third news report, published May 6th by the American Council on Science and Health, returns our attention to the goal of herd immunity. The news is not good. The article, titled "Unherd Immunity, COVID Pulls Another Trick Out of Its Viral Envelope," basically states that we will never reach the goal of herd immunity. The details behind this conclusion include a comparison of the B4 and B5 strains of the Omicron variant of COVID, and specifically, the bad news that infection with an earlier form of Omicron appears to offer no protection against the B4 B5 strains of Omicron. Indeed, it's possible to become infected with a B4 B5 strain of Omicron while still suffering from an earlier Omicron strain. Such conditions strongly suggest that herd immunity is not in the cards. What does this mean for society? The American Council on Science and Health article emphasizes the uncertainty around the future course of COVID. Even so, a few sociological concerns about what challenges society may face and what resources society will have to face them can be noted. For one, the evidence of cognitive impacts of COVID suggests that there are real and continuing risks of COVID, despite widespread COVID fatigue. Vaccines and treatments have reduced the mortality rate, and that's a step in the right direction. but the ideal vaccine would almost eliminate infections. Even before the surge of mutations, the vaccines were unable to accomplish this goal, and the mutations have made that goal even less attainable. Unfortunately, the emerging research indicates that even mild COVID cases are associated with long-term deleterious impacts on individuals' quality of life, as well as reductions in the cognitive capacity of members of society. Consequently, regardless of what happens going forward, there will be costs of COVID for the foreseeable future, costs traceable not to lockdowns and mask mandates and other public health guidance, but instead traceable directly to the characteristics of the pathogens. Second, fatigue with public health guidelines has led many to throw off masks and take a deep breath of fresh air, or at least air as fresh as it can be in a plane, store, or other enclosed facility. Mask mandates have been widely withdrawn, and vaccine rates have not taken their place. Yet, the emerging research indicates that while mortality rates have been driven down by better treatments and vaccines, COVID remains incredibly destructive. There are fewer funerals, but they have been replaced by decades of cognitive aging occurring in a matter of weeks. Cognitive declines that may affect up to a quarter of COVID survivors for the rest of their lives. One wonders how many people would be ripping off their masks if these risks were widely known, or if a public information campaign showing the real-life implications of these risks were launched. Notably, younger people, concerned about losing 1 to 2 decades of cognitive capability owing to COVID, might be most responsive to such an information campaign if it were done in a savvy way. We may never know, and that lack of knowledge has more to do with the way society is engaging COVID than with inherent features of the pathogen. There are more societal costs one could tally. How many children will fail to reach their potential because of the upheaval they experienced in their education? How many businesses that hung on by a thread through the first 2 years of the pandemic will ultimately succumb because the situation drained their ability to survive? How may families need to respond to COVID survivors' premature cognitive decline? And how, if at all, might that response be gendered? And there are many other questions for which we need answers. There remains a great amount of uncertainty. But we do have answers to some questions. We know that COVID has come to our town, takes many, leaves survivors often with reduced cognitive capacity, mutates in ways that make herd immunity impossible, and at least in the US, is now stalking a land of people fed up with taking steps to protect themselves and others. These facts are not reassuring. In fact, they suggest that we may never return to normal, if we define normal as how things were during the summer of 2019. This may sound sad, but it's actually the opening to a sound of hope. When the HIV/AIDS pandemic began, people may have feared that sexual intimacy would never be possible again. Some of them may have therefore refused to take any precautions. But many other people adapted. They learned how to protect themselves and others while being intimate. I doubt that people of the height of the HIV/AIDS era loved each other any less than did those who lived before. And, truth be told, HIV/AIDS is still with us, and it is still affecting how people embrace. But note, people still embrace. COVID is another pandemic posing different challenges, but in many ways, the most sociologically healthy response is the same. People must adapt. Our surest chance to make it through the COVID pandemic with as much of our abilities intact as possible depends crucially on realizing and accepting that COVID is part of a new normal. In this new normal, we can thrive. But just like with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, to thrive, we must let go of nostalgia. Instead, we must set about building a life and a set of practices that will work under the conditions under which we now live. Work for us, for strangers we encounter, and for those we love. That's This Week in Sociological Perspective. We'll be taking a 2-week break, but we'll be back on June 2nd with another interview with an author of some important sociological research and more sociological insights on an issue in the news. Till then, take care.